Archbishop Antje Jackelén, I'm very happy to meet you here, and it's a great honor for me that you join this little interview.
Nice to meet you too.
Thank you so much. I invited you, first of all, as a leading person of the Church of Sweden, of course, but also as an interdisciplinary engaged theological scholar, because the Corona period is, for me, in some respect, also a special case of the relationship between science and religion. First, there is a natural event like the virus. Then there are empirical data about this event, and these data challenge interpretation and action. Interpretation and action by the society as a whole, but also by the churches. And so my first question would be, how does the government, and in comparison to this, how does the Church of Sweden react to the virus and the scientific findings of the virologists?
Yeah, in Sweden, science enjoys great authority, especially natural science. So it was a natural thing to do for the Swedish government to rely heavily on the experts. In fact, there has been sort of a discussion of whether the government is relying too much on its experts and leaving some of the initiative and the responsibility that the government should take over to the experts. So science is not a question, but of course what is special in this situation is that it's new, knowledge is evolving quite fast, but we also have huge risks, and evidence is preliminary and limited. So of course, as the knowledge increases, recommendations change, and that is not always so easily communicated. People who are familiar with science know that necessarily at this stage of research, there is a lot of uncertainty, and there is a lot of complexities, and depending on how uncertainties and complexities unfold and intersect with each other, the situation becomes messy. But usually people expect clarity from science. So communicating uncertainty and complexity, both to policymakers and to the general public, can be difficult. But at the same time, doing this, communicating uncertainty and complexities in good ways, is essential to maintaining trust in both experts, but also politicians and the advisors to politicians. So I think that is a little bit special in this situation, that you clearly see something of the process of science. You don't only see the results, but you see also the process, and which involves uncertainties and complexities.
Has the Church fully accepted the government's restrictions, or were there some disagreements as well?
Do you mean whether we have diverging opinions?
Yeah.
No, as you may know, Sweden never went into a complete lockdown, and there were never any restrictions specifically for the activities of faith communities. We were subject to the same general recommendations as they were in place for other kinds of activities, which was basically that physical distancing, hygiene rules, and never gather more than 50 people at the same time. And we have applied that to our activities, church services, which meant that we didn't just cancel everything, but we tried to adapt. And adaptation in some places meant that people in charge said, no, we cannot have a regular public worship live now. In some places it was cancelled and replaced by digital worship services, digital devotions of different kinds, or churches were kept open for private devotion, lighting candles, and minor services, and so on. So it looked a bit different, also depending on how the situation was in different kinds of the country, because I mean, the virus moves, right? So not all parts of the country were affected in the same way at the same time. So also in that respect, there needed to be some adaptation. What we have seen when it comes to church life, that especially initially, there was a boom in digital worship services. So regular worship services that are televised on a regular basis in Sweden, they basically doubled the numbers of people who watched. And congregations who sent digital had very impressive numbers. Like, for example, the Cathedral of Uppsala here had 7 live streamed services during the week before Easter and Easter. And more than 17,000 watched those directly, let alone those who watched them later. We would never have had that many people in church. So, and also we have examples of like groups for children or for young children and parents, singing groups and so on. It was put on Facebook and all of a sudden reached like 10,000 people from a small congregation. So it was quite amazing. The church, I say the church, there were 2 big D's, 2 capital D's emerged, the digital and the diaconal. So our deacons and our diaconal work stepped up very quickly to, for instance, assist people, elderly people, or other people in risk groups to assist them with getting food and medicine and things like that.
Well, shortly back to the regulations. Some people, including the World Health Organization, have praised the so-called special path of Sweden and considered it an ideal model for dealing with the pandemic. But my question is, was the price of this approach eventually not too high?
Well, I think the jury on this is still out. We simply don't know. We have had high numbers when it comes to people who have died, especially elderly people. And we have had a lot of elderly care facilities where the virus has crept in, which of course feels like something was missing. We should have been able to protect the elderly in better ways. But then of course they like struggle, say, well, what are the right figures? Can you compare the figures of deaths between countries because they number them? And so I think the jury is still out. But what we need to have is a severe discussion about human dignity. Because actually in Sweden, we have like mistranslated the UN Declaration for Human Rights. It says people are equal in dignity and rights. And in Sweden it's translated in equal in value and rights. And as a value, you can, like this is a quantitative term, you can have more or less value, but dignity is either you have dignity or you don't have. I mean, it's more a qualitative term. And I think we have to have serious conversations in our society about how we actually look at people, because there are some stories being told about elderly people not having received the same care as other people, although there still were empty beds in hospitals. So at this point, we do not know whether these are single stories, how much truth there is to them. So we need to have a commission. We're actually going to have in Sweden a Corona commission. And I hope that they also will look into this more basic questions of human dignity. How have we upheld human dignity? What does it mean to uphold human dignity in a time of crisis like this?
I think in Germany, the restriction sometimes prohibited pastoral care, especially at the end of life. Some people really died alone without support of their relatives, without support of the churches. Was it in Sweden similar?
Not as much as I think in Germany, but what we did when it comes to pastoral care, that we doubled our resources when it comes to pastoral care via the telephone, and also when it comes to pastoral care via chat on the internet. And we realized that young people often prefer chat before the phone. We also, the hospital chaplaincies, they try to assist the staff, hospital staff, with like simple formulas to use when like when a person died without anybody being present. So of course that is a hardship, that dying people were left alone due to the virus. We have also tried to find ways of doing pastor or family counseling via the internet, and got a new sort of program for that. We have also seen that since way before this pandemic, we have this possibility of lighting virtual candles and put prayers on the website of the church. And we've seen that people have done so in increasing numbers.
What skills do religious communities give people to constructively cope with the Corona crisis? What functions, especially what functions do prayers have? You can't pray away Corona, can you?
Well, religious practices, to put it that way, nourish hope, courage, and resilience. And these are important components in order to cope with the crisis and all that follows with the crisis. Religious practice like prayer reassures you of the basic relationality that is characteristic for all of us, but that we tend to forget sometimes. We are related to God, the Creator, to the whole of creation, to our fellow human beings, and to ourselves. And prayer makes all these dimensions of our relatedness so brings them to life, and thus nourishes hope, courage, and resilience. And of course, intercession and knowing that in prayer you are united with people all around the world gives a strength and assurance that is, I think, crucial to coping with a crisis.
In a short remark, you talked about spiritual resilience. Can you elaborate it a bit?
Especially in times of crisis, because if you are resilient, you have a better chance to adapt, to thrive in spite of all the hardships that may be coming up, and where you have your spiritual grounding, I think, is an important part of this resilience. So that's why I talk about spiritual resilience. I mean, in this situation of reflection, because we have to ask, what is it that is the most important thing, and how do we really, really want to live together as people on this earth, as part of creation? I think giving time and space and language for all of this contributes to fostering a spiritual resilience.
You are a member of the Corona Spectrum project. This project brought together at least 40 major faith leaders. And they say, we need practical guidance to an anxious and suffering humanity. What does that mean in detail?
This crisis, like many other crises, creates unrest, both personal, but can also create a lot of social unrest, of course. It is also a time for reflection, and is a time for learning. And in this unrest, of course, there is the struggle with fear and uncertainty. And both fear and uncertainty are things that need to be taken seriously. Now, the Swedish society is a society that has enjoyed a long time of stability. Remember that Sweden does not have any memories of being at war in the last century. So there is, as a whole, there is not an active memory of having to cope with catastrophe. So we need to make use of the strength and the wisdom of our spiritual traditions. There may be no low-hanging fruits, but certainly good fruits a little higher up in the tree. By that I mean that we can learn to live with fear. Now, if you have difficulties with fear, I think what we naturally tend to do is either to face up to distract it, to get rid of it, or the other option is not to accept the fear and trying to get distracted from it. But neither distraction or distraction is a good thing in the long run. But I tend to empathize with Søren Kierkegaard, the theologian and philosopher, who says, the one who has learned to be anxious, to feel anxiety in the right way, has learned the most important thing. And I think that applies also to uncertainty. If we can learn that, we have learned something very important. And I mean, the practices of spirituality are certainly of great help here. And speaking as a Christian, I mean, the pandemic hit during the time of Lent, when we exercise ourselves, practice ourselves to abstain. Now, usually you practice abstention on Lent on a voluntary basis. Now we all were forced all of a sudden to abstain from things. And that has a huge significance to how we look at what happiness is, how we look at actually how dependent we are and to get a deeper understanding of that relationality I was speaking about, relatedness to God, to creation, to humanity, to ourselves.
Learning sometimes implies also reflection. You talked about it before. This may arouse the question, how can religious people integrate the virus into their worldview, especially their religious worldview of a loving and caring God?
For myself, my calendar changed very abruptly. No travels, a lot of things cancelled, a lot of new meetings in a way, but also time to reflect and write. So actually, I wrote a little book. Which is,
in English available as well?
Unfortunately not. I would love to have it published in English as well, but it comes out in the beginning of this month, and the title is Impatient in Hope, Theological Questions in the Shadow of the Pandemic.
Okay.
The theological questions, I think, that present themselves anew in the shadow of this pandemic is creation really good in spite of the pandemic? How can we speak about good creation if there is this virus? What do we do about evil? And that applies both to natural evil and to moral evil. And how do we know that God cares? And what actually is a human being between strength and weakness? And how can we do church at this time? Both be the church and to make church happen, so to speak. And finally, what may we hope for? And how do we cultivate hope in times of crisis? I think these are questions that need to be talked about.
The virus is a natural evil, not a moral evil as such. So is there a special argument for natural evils?
I think philosophically and theologically, the differentiation between natural evil and moral evil is helpful, but in practice, the difference is blurred more and more, which, I mean, climate change is a very good example. You can't really tell the difference anymore between evil that is purely natural and evil that is purely moral. I mean, say you can't educate volcanoes, but you can certainly find evidence for human activity worsening or bettering the consequences of things that we attribute to sort of natural evil. Now, and of course, if you want to speak about creation as good, one way of putting it is where creation is both good and on its way of being good. And I think complexity research is quite helpful in understanding how crises and catastrophes play a role in bringing forth a world where you have both freedom and consciousness. And of course, that brings us to saying, okay, seeing the patterns that make us understand why there is such a thing as a virus is not the same thing as giving it a meaning. We still have the pain and the grief and all of that. So the biblical tradition and the liturgical tradition of lament is very much necessary and a gift, actually.
Okay, you mentioned climate change. Can the experience of dealing with the empirical findings be transferred from the corona crisis to the environmental crisis?
Well, some people say that the corona crisis is a rehearsal for what we are about to face in the wake of the climate crisis. And there may be something to it. There is some wisdom to be gathered here. I mean, just the insight that we very quickly and very powerfully could adapt to this crisis and change things is something that we can take with us when it comes to the threat of climate change. If we can change so much so quickly, why then can't we, in a slower pace, but equally powerful, mitigate the risks of climate change?
Archbishop Antje Jackelén, many thanks for this great interview. I wish you a lot of success in giving hope in times of crisis. And thank you very much for being here, for the opportunity to have this interview with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure for me as well.